Should evil in the world be taken as proof? Proof that God certainly does not exist. Proof that certainly there is no God. This is an interesting question, and an important one too. Many have argued that evil in the world should be taken as evidence that God certainly does not exist. And this line of argumentation is called the logical problem of evil, or even sometimes called the deductive problem of evil. I once received a question related to this when I was taking part in a panel discussion. Perhaps this is something you have wrestled with personally as well. And so I hope this content brings incredible value to you. If you feel it is bringing value to you, please subscribe to this podcast, like or follow Timotheus Academy's social media accounts and posts, and share this content widely with your friends and family. Now back to our discussion. Is evil evidence that God certainly does not exist? Is the logical problem of evil and that line of argumentation correct? Is the deductive problem of evil and that line of argumentation correct? To answer these questions, we must address many matters from the outset. We must address the question, what is meant by the word evil? What is meant by the description, the problem of evil? What in fact is logic? And moreover, what is deductive logic? These are simply context matters that we must address before we begin to wrestle with the question, should evil in the world be taken as proof that God certainly does not exist, proof that there is no God? The first question we must ask ourselves is, what is meant by evil? This is not to ask, what can we describe as being evil? But it is simply to ask, what is evil itself? Stated in another way, if we are to say something is evil, what are we saying about that thing by calling it evil? Now, we normally think of evil only in a moral sense. Nearly everyone you meet on the street will concede that murder is evil, that kidnapping is evil, that stealing is evil. We might say in a moral sense that failing to do what is right is morally evil. And in fact, doing what is wrong is morally evil. We can imagine the good guys and the bad guys, the heroes and the villains. We might imagine a scene from the Wild West. We might say that the town sheriff is good, and the villains in the town that are trying to do all sorts of horrible things are, in fact, evil. But we should not think of evil in terms of morality alone. Yes, there is a moral goodness and a moral evil. But what we are discussing here is more encompassing than morality. Yes, moral evil is a kind of evil, but it's not the only kind of evil. What is evil simply, or what is common to all kinds of evil, is that it is the absence of some good that ought to be present. We might understand what is meant by the good as that which ought to be present. Evil is simply the absence of that good that ought to be present. Now, how do we know what ought to be present? Well, reality shows us what ought to be present, or rather our apprehension of reality and our reflection upon it. Further, the Christian scriptures tell us what ought to be present in propositional form and by understanding what is meant by the narrative texts and other interpretive methods that we use to understand the scriptures. And God is the author of both of these. This is the position of the philosopher Thomas Aquinas. Moral goodness is what ought to be present in a moral sense. A moral sense refers to actions. When we're discussing morality, we're talking about actions, whether they are mental actions or physical actions, whether they relate to how we are thinking or whether they relate to how we are acting in a physical sense. Whenever we want to discuss moral goodness and moral evil, we have to commit to a moral theory. We might look to consequentialism. We might look to utilitarianism. We might look to virtue ethics. These are all going to tell us very different things about what it means to be morally good and morally evil. Now, the moral theory that I understand to be correct falls under virtue ethics. It is Thomistic natural law, or the natural law theory of Thomas Aquinas. For a far more comprehensive treatment of the moral theory of Thomas Aquinas, I can refer you to Ethica Thomistica by Ralph McInerney. When we look at the moral theory of Thomas Aquinas, which is Thomistic natural law, we can understand that God created humans. Humans have natures, which is another way of explaining what a human being is. What a human is will determine what a human should pursue and avoid. And when a human pursues what he ought to pursue, it is good. When a human pursues what he ought not to pursue, it is evil. Further, when a human avoids what he ought, it is good. And when he avoids what he ought not, it is evil. When a human pursues and obtains that which is good, the human will flourish. When a human pursues and obtains that which is evil, the human will not flourish, but actually corrupt. I know this sounds very complicated, and the reason is because it is very complicated. But once it is understood and is seen as being true, it is also a very powerful moral theory. There is such a thing as metaphysical evil as well. Now, metaphysics is simply the study of being. Not really a being, but being itself, what philosophers might call being qua being. What does it mean to exist? What does it mean to exist in a specific way? What is substantial existence? What is accidental existence? How can a thing exist? How can it change? What can we say about it? These are metaphysical questions. Now, the reason this science is called metaphysics is because the work of Aristotle that explores it followed his book on physics, and so it was simply called metaphysics, and that's why we call this science metaphysics today. There is such a thing as metaphysical evil. What is it? Now, evil is simply the absence of some good that ought to be present, and a metaphysical evil is the absence of some being that ought to be present, or some aspect of being even. This is not regarding moral actions, but regards something more primary. A stone lacking bark is not evil, because it's not in the nature of a stone to have bark if we are understanding stones to have nature. And so we might say the absence of bark in a stone is not a privation of a good, it is not evil. But a tree should have bark. It is within the nature of a tree to have bark, and trees do have natures because they are naturally occurring things. That's a far more detailed discussion. We won't have that here. But it is in the nature of a tree to have bark. And so the absence of bark in a tree that ought to have bark is an evil. It's not a moral evil, it's a metaphysical evil, because according to the nature of a tree should have bark. Again, I know this may be unusual to think of things this way, but a tree that is in the woods lacking bark is not a moral evil, but it is a metaphysical evil. Remember, metaphysics is the study of being. It is within the nature of a tree to have bark, and the lack of bark in a tree that ought to have bark is then a metaphysical evil. Likewise, it is in the nature of a human to be able to find humor in certain situations. This is called risibility. Lack of risibility in a tree is not evil, because it's not in the nature of a tree to be able to find humor in things. Rot in a tree might be said to be evil, because it is a privation of being. A tree is a natural thing. It should not have rot. Rot is the absence of something that ought to be present. It is a metaphysical evil in a tree. A hole in an apple that a worm has made is evil, because it's a privation of being. It's not a moral evil, it's a metaphysical evil. An apple is a natural thing. It should not have wormholes. And when we see a worm makes holes in an apple, then we see that is a metaphysical evil in an apple. It is the absence of something, namely apple substance, that ought to be present in the apple according to the nature of apple. A cavity in a tooth is evil because it's a privation of being. A tooth is a naturally occurring thing, so long as it is part of a human being, and it should not have a cavity in it. When it develops a cavity, this is called an evil. This is not a moral evil, it's a metaphysical evil. Now, neither the tree, nor the apple, nor the tooth is morally blameworthy. These are not moral evils. But all we're discussing when we discuss evil is whether something is absent which ought to be present. And in these examples, the answer is yes. Now, some people will also add to these categories we've discussed, that is, moral evil and metaphysical evil. We'll also add the category of natural evils, perhaps noting a tree falling in the woods and landing on an animal and harming it and causing it to suffer. They might call this a natural evil. They might point to a flood destroying a flock of animals as being evil. They might point to lightning striking and causing a forest fire. These seem to simply reduce to what we've already described, which is metaphysical evils, that something is lacking regarding being, which should be present regarding being. So we've looked at metaphysical evils, we've looked at moral evils, we've looked at evil. What is evil? Evil is a privation, the absence of some good that ought to be present. And of course, much more could be said about this, much more has been said about this, but this is sufficient for our examination today. Now, what we're talking about today is called the logical or deductive problem of evil. What is meant by that description, the problem of evil? Now, this might seem quite odd to ask this question. After all, anyone who understands what evil is would understand it to be a problem. Evil is obviously a problem, and the examples here mentioned point out lots of problems that evil has caused. If something ought to be present and is not present, that is a problem. And so to understand what evil is to understand that evil is a problem. Yet this is not what is meant by the description, the logical problem of evil, or the deductive problem of evil. When people speak of the problem of evil, they are mentioning, or they are trying to describe, that evil poses a problem for someone who wants to affirm that God does exist. Whenever someone's making this logical problem of evil argument, or this deductive problem of evil argument, they're not talking about whether evil is a problem generally. They're talking about these as problems for someone who wants to claim that God does exist. What they're trying to articulate is that if someone wants to claim that God does exist, evil in the world is a problem for that claim. This is what is meant by the deductive problem of evil, or the logical problem of evil. That evil in the world is a problem for someone arguing that God does exist. Now recall that one of these lines of argumentation is called the logical problem of evil. We then must ask ourselves and answer, what is logic? We can't say what the logical problem of evil is if we don't know what logic is. And I found that people tend to use the word logic in many different ways. When I'm referencing logic here, what I'm talking about is Socratic or Aristotelian logic. What I'm referencing here is the logic that may have been referred to by Socrates or codified and formulated more precisely by Aristotle. Logic generally is simply a method for measuring our thinking or governing or organizing our thinking. For a good treatment on logic, I recommend Peter Kreeft's Socratic Logic version 3.1. For a much deeper treatment, I recommend Peter Coffey's The Science of Logic, and I believe that comes in 2 volumes. I've used both of these when teaching logic at the undergraduate and master's level. Logic gives us rules for thinking well. When we follow all the rules of logic, we are said to think rationally. When we fail to do so, we are said to think irrationally. It's not so much that following rules or not following rules makes us rational or irrational. It really is more precisely that the rules themselves are important for formulating rational thinking. These rules of thinking are not simply made up, they arise from reality. In this sense, yes, logic is said to measure our thinking or govern or organize our thinking, but logic itself is measured by reality. Peter Coffey, in the volume I referenced just previously, makes this point, meaning the point that the rules of logic arise from reality. Anyone with even a passing understanding of logic normally has some acquaintance with the three indemonstrable laws of logic, one of which is the law of non-contradiction, sometimes called, and I think Peter Coffey refers to it as simply the law of contradiction. This law of logic is indemonstrable. You would have to use the law of non-contradiction to somehow prove or disprove the law of non-contradiction. We see that it is not only a law of our thinking, but it is also a law of being. The reason we cannot mentally think of the moon both orbiting and not orbiting the Earth at the same time and in the same respect is because the moon itself cannot both orbit and not orbit the Earth at the same time and in the same respect. Yes, the moon can orbit and or not orbit the Earth at different times or in different respects, but it can't both orbit and not orbit the Earth at the same time and in the same respect. And since it cannot do this in reality, our minds cannot conceive of this being the case mentally. Again, logic is a system, an organizer to measure our thinking. It comes from reality, and reality has been made, fashioned, and determined by God. So in this sense, the rules which govern our thinking have been determined by God. The argument that evil in the world should be taken as evidence that God certainly does not exist, as we previously mentioned, is called the logical problem of evil, because it uses logic in many different ways to make the argument. But we see that it is not merely logic, but deductive logic that is pointed to by this problem of evil. That's why it's called not only the logical problem of evil, but it's also called the deductive problem of evil. Deductive logic is a kind of logic, specifically one whereby an argument moves from general premises to a specific type of conclusion. It is the type of argumentation that will yield certainty in the conclusion. So it is a big deal to ask and answer this question, whether the deductive problem of evil is successful. The argument that evil in the world should be taken as evidence that God certainly does not exist must then rely on deductive logic in order to yield certainty. Here is an example of a deductive argument. The first premise is all men are mortal. The second premise is Socrates is a man. And the conclusion that is reached from this reasoning is Socrates is mortal. Now, deductive logic isn't giving us these premises. Deductive logic alone is not telling us that all men are mortal. Deductive logic alone is not telling us that Socrates is a man. But deductive logic is moving through these premises to come to a conclusion. The premise, all men are mortal, is a very general premise. We see then that moving from the general to the more specific, Socrates is a man, is something that we would expect in deductive logic. Stating something about all men, then stating something about a single man, and then coming to a conclusion about Socrates the individual, we see the conclusion of this deductive argument is Socrates is mortal. Yes, deductive reasoning claims certainty regarding its conclusions, but this entirely assumes that the premises are themselves correct and that the logic is correct as well. Atheists and those who might otherwise make the deductive problem of evil argument have understood that a deductive argument might be formed against the existence of God because of the fact that evil is present. The argument begins with some kind of a general premise that there would not be any instance of evil in the world if God existed. The more specific premise that would follow points out that there are in fact instances of evil in the world. And of course, then the specific conclusion that is reached is that God does not exist. Now, assuming that this deductive logic is correct and all the premises are true, there would be certainty in this conclusion. However, are all these premises true? Not at all. No, they are not all true. Specifically, that first general premise. The first general premise claims that there would not be any instance of evil in the world at all if God existed. The entire argument rests on this premise. The question is this premise true? And the answer is obviously no. This premise is not true. Now, where might this premise come from? How might this premise be developed in the first place? Now, the classical theistic understanding of God is that he is all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good. The atheist making the deductive problem of evil argument is trying to point out that all three of these divine attributes are not possible given instances of evil in the world. The atheist is trying to point out that if there are instances of evil in the world, then God must either not exist, he must not be all-powerful, or he must not be all-knowing, or he must not be all-good. This thinking is not new. It is quite old. I'll read from Michael Martin's work, Atheism, A Philosophical Justification, specifically page 344, accessed via Google Books. He quotes Epicurus as asking the following: God either wishes to take away all evil and is unable, or he is able and unwilling, or he is neither willing nor able, or he is both willing and able. If he is willing and unable, then he is feeble, which is not in accordance with the character of God. If he is able and unwilling, he is envious, which is equally at variance with God. If he is neither willing nor able, he is both envious and feeble, and therefore not God. If he is both willing and able, which is alone suitable to God, from what source then are evils, or why does he not remove them? I know there was a lot in that, but we understand that from this type of reasoning, atheists have formulated the premise that there would not be any instance of evil in the world at all if God existed, or more specifically, if an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good God existed, which is the God of classical theism. From this, atheists have devised their argument, and they deductively reason that God certainly does not exist because there are instances of evil. However, is this true? No, it's not true. Theists have responded by pointing out that God is all good, God is all knowledgeable, he is all powerful, as a classical theistic understanding of God affirms. And Christians have pointed out as well, there could be many reasons why there are instances of evil, even given the fact that God exists, and he is all good, all knowledgeable, and all powerful. Now, I won't go into all of those reasons here, but clearly we understand that in the book of Job, the Bible specifically gives an example where there is an instance of evil and suffering in the life of Job, yet God is still all good, all knowledgeable, all powerful, and clearly exists. In the book of Genesis, we see a clear example. Joseph's brothers meant what they did to him for evil, and he was sold into slavery and went into Egypt. But ultimately, how the account concludes, we see it brought about an incredible good for all of Israel. And we see that it is said God meant it for good, even though his brothers meant it for evil. And all of Israel, they were saved because of what God brought about. So we see clearly there is an instance of evil, yet God still exists. He is all good, all knowledgeable, and all powerful. Thomas Aquinas himself argues for what might be called the greater good theodicy, A theodicy is a type of argumentation that defends God against criticisms such as what we are seeing the atheist might make here. But this greater good theodicy claims that God specifically will allow an instance of evil because they are somehow means for bringing about a greater good or a lesser evil. And so evil can take place, and yet God can still exist, be all good, all knowledgeable, and all powerful. And so we see this first premise in the argument the atheist might make for the deductive problem of evil fails. It is not true, and because of that, the entire argument fails. The deductive problem of evil fails. There are many reasonable possibilities which account for the fact that there may be instances of evil in the world, and yet God still exists, and He is still all good, all knowledgeable, all powerful. So in conclusion, we find that many or most atheists today have conceded that the deductive problem of evil is not successful, that it fails. The answer is no. Evil in the world should not be understood as proof that God certainly does not exist. It should not be understood as proof that there certainly is no God. In fact, atheist J.L. Mackie, in his work The Miracle of Theism, specifically page 154, which I accessed on Google Books, concedes the following: "We can concede that the problem of evil does not, after all, show that the central doctrines of theism are logically inconsistent with one another." Again, atheist J.L. Mackie is stating that the deductive problem of evil has failed. That understanding that God exists, and that He is at the same time all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good, is not logically inconsistent. In other words, the deductive problem of evil fails. And the defeat of this formulation is significant, again, because deductive reasoning claims to yield certainty. And we owe a great debt to philosophers who have gone before us, who have successfully defeated, through philosophical arguments, the deductive problem of evil. I hope this content has brought incredible value to you. Again, if you feel it has brought value to you, please subscribe to this podcast, like or follow our social media accounts and posts, share this with your friends and family. Please be sure also to visit TimotheusAcademy.com for links to more content, and as always, I hope to see you again soon at Timotheus Academy.